Hi, everyone. Kumar Danatran here with Agile Meridian, and we're on for our fourth edition of the SAFE series, and we're going to be covering the fourth principle of SAFE, which is build incrementally with fast integrated learning cycles. It sounds fairly simple and easy to understand. What do you all think, Mike and Chris?
Well, it is.
Want to
It's
go with
kind of the
Michael
heart of
first?
Agile. Yeah, sure. It's the heart of Agile, right? That fast learning cycle, fast incremental learning cycle is kind of the heart of what we try to do in an Agile transformation or adoption. The idea is that we're going to learn something. We're going to do some work. We're going to plan some work. We're going to do some work. We're going to check that work. And then we're going to adapt or do something from what we learn. And I think PDCA or that feedback loop is kind of at the heart of everything we do in Agile. So that this is the fourth principle is interesting. I think there's some power in those words. That integrated learning cycle we often I think we may overlook a little bit sometimes when we're thinking about this, delivering value. What are we learning? What are we doing with that learning? Mm-hmm. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this was kind of one of those right? I mean, if you're in Agile, you kind of know this, or you should know this. But I think what is really interesting about this particular topic, right, is that I can't tell you the number of clients I've worked with and teams I've worked with where the team gets it. They get we build it incrementally, but they don't get it when you start talking about team of teams or multiple teams, right? At the program level, when you start talking about building incrementally, they don't think about that. I just went through it with a client, right? They go through their budget cycle and they allocate their pennies out wherever they may go. And they're not thinking about iteratively what we're going to go do, right? They're thinking about, here's what we're going to do all year. And, I asked them in the scope, when was the last time you did that? And they said, well, we never actually lived up to our business plan. And it's like, okay, if you haven't lived up to your business plan, why do you do it, right? And so that iterative and incremental, I think, is important because you want to do it at all levels, right? You don't want to just do it at the team level.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that what you bring up, Chris, and I've gone through the same sort of experiences with some of the clients where, I think this principle is really good. It's the heart of Agile. It's the heart of SAFE. I do think there's a word missing, and that word is iterative. Build incrementally with fast integrated learning cycles. Mm-hmm. It should say something like build iteratively and incrementally with fast learning cycles. Hold on, let me just finish writing this. And the reason is, it's easy to build incrementally. You build your database in one increment, and then you build your business logic in next increment, and then you build your UI, your user interface, and how the customer accesses it, and then you put it all together, and voila, you're done. Except you're not really learning anything because you're not getting feedback after each increment of activity. So, I think the intent of this is not just to build incrementally, but to build iteratively and incrementally both.
Yeah.
Right. So you're building a sort of a rough version, an MVP of something to get feedback from your customer or from internal customers or stakeholders or whatever it might be. And you're doing that rapidly and fast, and those learning cycles fuels what you build next and how you enhance it.
Chris, when you were calling that out, that teams get it, but when you do it at the program or the scaling, I think that's key. And I think some of that is the word build, right? Mm-hmm. Even the word build can front load this. The teams are building, right? They're the ones doing the true building. But at the program level and the budgeting level or portfolio level or wherever we're operating, it's the planning that's got to be using this principle too, right? Because that iterative incremental also applies there. And I feel like a lot of times most organizations that I've coached, they rush to solutioning, right? So we got our budget, we got our project, here's our goals, we're gone, we're solutioning right here. And I think that your word iterative, Kumar, has to also apply with the planning. And this principle, when you think about faster learning cycles, okay, plan a little something, but how do we validate your plan? I mean, if you go into SAFe, you're talking about lean MVP and the lean startup model there at the epics and how we validate epics. That's all related to this. And so if you've got a feedback loop that's circling for epics, and then you've got one that's circling for features, and then one that's circling for stories, this principle, and I think that's where scaling came in, said, listen, to your point, everybody knows this is for squads, for teams, but now it also applies at these other layers. And I think the big trick, if you will, in scaling anyway, is how do we make those three circles spin correctly and feed one another and feed back to one another. I think that's part of this challenge of this principle.
Yeah, when we speaking specifically about SAFe, right? SAFe is not sure. There's parts of it like Scrum and Kanban, right, at the team level, but fundamentally, that's not why SAFe exists, right? SAFe's specialty is it's in the name. How do we scale this, right? Yep. How do we scale this up? And that's where we have problems. And if you're just talking about, hey, we're going to map out the year and we're going to go forward, and we're going to do a year-long budget, we're not going to look at it, we're not going to adjust it, it just doesn't work anymore, right? And that's the advantage of SAFe is, it helps you scale. And I think it's an important thing as well. I tell customers, partners, people, anybody that'll listen to me, which isn't very many people, but I tell anybody that'll listen to me, we're going to go do SAFe. Great. That's wonderful. How are you doing on your agile transformation? And they're going to go, well, we're doing SAFe. And it's like, no.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Chris.
Let's focus on getting the agile part good, right? And then we're going to talk about scaling. And I know the implementation plan for SAFe says go, you do this and then you do this, and they've got a very laid out approach, right? I believe you get the teams, introduce them to Agile 3 months or so before to let them get used to being Agile. And then you start throwing SAFe at them, right? And the scaling approach and what have you. Because to your point, they don't really understand the value of feedback loops too, right? When we're talking about feedback loops, they don't understand it yet. When they're in there and we're throwing all this stuff at them, they don't really have an opportunity to absorb the agile part of this. And I'll shut up now and let Kumar talk.
Yeah, no. I think you're on a roll there, Chris. And I think you're right on as well. I recall a conversation with a potential client who their total organization is maybe 150 people, and their IT staff, their people that are building things for the rest of the organization to use is about 40. And their first question to us was, "Hey, we want to use SAFe. How can we want to use SAFe to do our work?" And I was kind of at a loss because they're so small, and so it was really, our questions are more about, well, what are you doing now in terms of your learning, establishing your learning cycles? How are you iterating and incrementing your way to delivering what your customers are expecting, your internal and external customers? And it turned out to be a good conversation, and also turned out to be a conversation where they determined that they didn't need to scale. They were small enough where there were other methods to learn, in these fast integrated learning cycles, learn enough about what they need to build and how to build it, that they didn't need that scaling mechanism for them. But your point is a good one, because it's always really important to establish those learning cycles, the feedback cycles, and the iterative and incremental way of that Agile proposes, that PDCA, Michael, you mentioned that, right? Plan, do, check, and act. and establishing that as a sort of a core foundational set of practices. And then you sort of determine how do we scale this to multiple teams or multiple teams of teams.
Yeah. I just got out of a meeting yesterday where one of the key things they want to do this year is they want to continuously improve their delivery and engagement with the customer. And my question to them was, so what does that mean? What are you doing to actually build in those feedback loops, right? What are you doing to actually learn? Are you doing retrospectives? Are you doing a customer journey? Do you have personas? And you start throwing those words out, and they're looking at you like, I don't know.
What's that mean?
Come to find out, this organization that's doing, it's doing $4 billion worth of business a year doesn't have a customer journey map for their customers. And I'm like, well, then it's like trying to fit a puzzle together without the box top, right? Without the lid that shows you what the picture is. You have no idea. You're just trying to find stuff. You're just guessing. And that's what they're doing, is just guessing. And what I like about SAFE is that, and especially this principle, is you can apply this iterative approach from your personal life all the way up to the CEO's office, right?
Yeah.
Being iterative and incremental, and say, okay, instead of saying we're going to do this big massive thing, let's focus on this one thing right now, right? And get that done. And then we're going to focus on another. And if you think about it from that standpoint, if you think about it at team level, a sprint team go in 2 cycle or go on a 2-week cycle, they can make 26, if they just improve one thing a sprint, they can make 26 improvements in a year. 26 improvements. What kind of things are they going to be fixing at the end of the year, right? They're going to be fixing some pretty small stuff if they tackle their big things first. And the same thing applies at the enterprise level, the portfolio level, program level. Yeah. Anyway, I went right back on that rant. Sorry.
This must be your favorite principle, Chris.
Well, it is, because it's like, and I have to admit, I was not, when SAFE first came out, I was not a fan, right? I'm certainly not an individual that believes that applies to every single organization. But I think it does fit in being a stepping stone for those organizations that need to do what we're describing, right? They need to communicate and scale. And it's a nice framework to get started with. I don't think it's the end all be all. And I think you'd actually, I think organizations ought to be thinking about how they move past SAFE, right? To where it's just ingrained in them that they do that. But it's a great way to start for an organization. And it gets that, it's got that iterative, incremental approach built in to the enterprise level, the solution level, the program level, right? The release train level, as well as the team level. And it's really it's really good. It fits very nicely with our product journey loop that we've got, right? In terms of how you iteratively develop and build and what have you. It works very well.
It can. Michael, anything you want to add to this discussion?
No, I think we covered the salient points of the principle. Maybe a discussion. When you think about when is it not working, right? When you look at an organization, for me, it's a pretty big telltale sign if you know whether you're using this principle in a healthy way. A lot of times I'll see that the planning doesn't match up to the delivery, right? Or we do a whole bunch of design and planning up front with where the feedback loop is really wide, right? And and you're not even, you have sometimes no feedback loop. We take the first solution that comes along and off we go. And so, when you think about what does it look like at each level to see this, or, to see this functional, teams are easy. Teams, they deliver on a 2-week iteration and a sprint or whatever methodology you're using. And it's pretty straightforward. But I think the program and then of course the portfolio, how they're planning and feeding those teams, right? The care, I always like to call it the care and feeding of agile teams, requires the same principle, right? The planning cycle has to also be a feedback loop that's circling at a rate that the teams can pull from it as they plan work and produce the backlog. The teams are, pulling from that backlog, and then of course going through but the cycle is the same, right? So whether the doing might change, whether it's coding or planning. And I love when Chris, when you're saying you can use it all the way up through you can use it in your personal lives. Absolutely can. Been there, done that, got that t-shirt. But you can see that. And one of the first things I do with executive teams when I'm trying to, help them transform. And I always like to say, we should eat the dog. We've got to eat the dog food that we're feeding to everyone else. We got to eat our own dog food, right? And that is, let's put a Kanban board up. Let's take a look at our cycle. And Kanban's a great visualization tool where you can see your PDCA cycle, right? You can actually map it out and find out, where your choke points are. So I think, the last thing I would say is look for that. If you see you have big, wide feedback loops and or no feedback loop, this is where you can bring this principle out and say, okay, how do I get a feedback loop in here? Whether it's planning, coding, release management, doesn't matter, marketing, it could be in any area of an organization.
Mm-hmm. The analogy that comes to mind when I hear you talk about these cycles and these cycles within cycles is just a simple clock. The day is 24 hours. There's 60 minutes in an hour. There's 60 seconds in a minute. And you think about an organization. If you think of the day, the 24 hours in a day, that might be how often. Again, you extrapolate it to the organization, how often they need to plan to get feedback. And because they're planning on a larger time scale, it might take a while to get that feedback to where they can learn something and do something about it. Maybe it's a quarter, maybe it's a month, whatever it is. And then you've got at the team of teams level where their planning cycles the teams themselves are planning on a more frequent basis every 2 weeks. And they may get feedback on a daily basis. They should, right? If they're doing their daily stand-ups. And the individual developer may be getting feedback multiple times a day. Every time they do a check-in, a code check-in, they're getting feedback, hopefully, as long as they have some, systems in place to automatically test that their code hasn't broken something else. But regardless, you're getting feedback of some kind, maybe multiple times a day. So it's sort of like this. The learning cycles are built in. It's about the system, engineering the system in a way to take advantage of those learning points and making some changes from it. Again, building iteratively, incrementally, learning along the way. So I like, that's what came to my brain is the clock.
The only thing I would add would be when you think about learning cycles and we've been talking about, we get feedback and we can, I think it's important to talk about the fact that feedback not only comes from the outside, it not only comes from stakeholders and people, but it also comes from within the team, right? And the feedback loop is part of that is making sure that we're on a regular basis being iterative in a short enough time that we can do a little bit of work and figure and make the change and then go forward. We don't want to go for a long period, like say 2 months, doing something that's not productive, right? Or that's taking us down the wrong path. And sometimes we get into we want feedback, but we don't want feedback within our own little team, right? We don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
I think it's important we bring that up and talk about that or just mention it that, feedback comes internally as well as externally.
Well, I would argue that's the most important feedback is the team feedback and supporting and supporting the team to have crucial, honest conversations between the team members as to how they're going to improve the way they work and make use of these learning cycles is really important.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that should be a wrap for this principle. We'll come back again in a couple of weeks. We'll talk about principle 5, which is base milestones and objective evaluation of working systems. So we'll decode what that means. And in the meantime, please leave your comments below for this video, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.